My name is Laura Bennett, and I resigned on a Tuesday morning without drama or theatrics. I sent the email, wrapped up what I was responsible for, and handed over everything I was asked to hand over. By the afternoon, my access was gone, my calendar was wiped clean, and my role had already started disappearing from internal systems. The only thing left unresolved was my final pay, which I requested the same way I handled everything else, clearly, professionally, and in writing. The response came faster than I expected. My boss said the company had decided not to release my final payment. No policy reference. No justification. Just a short message implying that resignation changed things and that I should move on. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was confident. Like he assumed this was a line he could draw without anyone questioning it. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten legal action or copy HR. I replied once, asked for clarification, and saved the message. When no response came back, I stopped following up altogether. Silence felt intentional, not passive. What unsettled me wasn't the money. It was how certain he sounded. As if withholding pay was a personal decision he could make without consequence. As if no one else would ever see it. I closed my laptop and went about my day, already aware this wouldn't end the way he expected. Some decisions only feel final until someone looks at them closely. He thought this was over. It wasn't. The next morning, I checked my bank account out of habit, not expectation. Nothing had changed. No pending deposit. No adjustment. Just the same balance staring back at me like confirmation that my boss had meant what he said. I opened my email and reread his message, this time slower. The wording was casual, almost dismissive, as if final pay were a favor rather than an obligation. That confidence bothered me more than the refusal itself. I forwarded the email to my personal address and started a simple timeline. Dates. Times. Exact phrasing. I wasn't escalating anything, I was preserving it. Years in the workplace had taught me that memory fades quickly, but records don't. I checked the employee handbook, then my contract, then the resignation acknowledgement HR had sent automatically. Everything pointed in one direction, and none of it aligned with what my boss was doing. Still, I stayed quiet. By midday, I noticed something else. Payroll hadn't sent their usual automated confirmation. Normally, even delays triggered a system message. This time, there was nothing. No notice. No queue update. It was as if my pay had been manually paused rather than processed incorrectly. That distinction mattered. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake buried in bureaucracy. Someone had made a decision and assumed it would go unchallenged. The system hadn't failed, it had been instructed. I closed my laptop again, resisting the urge to push. If this really was intentional, reacting too quickly would only tip my hand. For the first time, I wondered how many other people had been handled this way, and how often it had gone unnoticed. That afternoon, I reached out to payroll directly, keeping my message neutral and factual. I asked whether there was an issue with processing my final payment and attached my resignation confirmation. I didn't mention my boss. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I framed it as a routine check, the kind no one would feel defensive answering. The reply came an hour later. Payroll confirmed they had been instructed not to release my final pay. No error. No missing paperwork. Just an instruction that hadn't come through the usual approval chain. The email was polite but careful, as if they were already aware the situation was unusual. They ended by saying I'd need to resolve it with management. That was the moment everything shifted. Payroll doesn't freeze payments casually. They follow process, not personalities. If they'd been given a direct instruction outside standard channels, it meant someone had stepped around safeguards and assumed no one would question it. I thanked them and didn't reply again. Instead, I added the email to my timeline and noted the phrasing they'd used. Instructed. Not advised. Not delayed. Instructed. That single word carried weight. I started to see the shape of what was happening. My boss hadn't just refused to pay me. He'd taken ownership of a decision he didn't fully understand the implications of. He thought authority ended the conversation. It rarely does. By choosing silence, I wasn't letting it slide. I was letting the situation exist exactly as it was, documented, unsupported, and increasingly visible to the wrong parts of the system. And systems, unlike people, don't care about confidence. That evening, I pulled up my employment contract and read it the way people rarely do, line by line, without skimming. I wasn't looking for loopholes or threats. I was looking for structure, obligations, boundaries. The kind of language that doesn't bend depending on who's in charge. The section on final compensation was clear. Payment timelines, conditions, jurisdictional requirements. There was no ambiguity. Resignation didn't void anything. In fact, it triggered specific deadlines. Deadlines that were now quietly being missed. What caught my attention was a reference at the bottom of the section, a compliance clause tied to wage governance. It wasn't dramatic or highlighted. Just a note indicating that certain delays automatically created reporting obligations beyond HR. I checked the date. The clock had already started. I sat back and considered my options. I could escalate immediately. Send screenshots. Quote policy. Force a reaction. But that would turn this into a dispute, something people could frame as emotional or adversarial. Instead, I chose restraint. By doing nothing, I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was allowing the system to do what it was designed to do when rules weren't followed. The longer the delay continued, the less control my boss would have over how it was handled. He believed this was a private disagreement. It wasn't. It was a process now. And processes don't knock before they enter. The second day passed without a word. No follow-up from my boss, no clarification from HR, no automated payroll notice correcting the delay. The silence felt deliberate, like they were waiting for me to get uncomfortable enough to react. I didn't. I treated the day like any other, running errands, answering personal emails, refusing to let their inaction dictate my pace. Late that afternoon, an automated acknowledgement landed in my inbox. It wasn't from HR or payroll. It was from a compliance intake system, confirming receipt of an inquiry related to final compensation timing. I hadn't submitted anything new. The system had logged the delay on its own, triggered by the missed deadline outlined in my contract. That confirmation changed the stakes. This was no longer about whether my boss wanted to pay me. A process had activated independently, and it didn't require my permission to continue. I reread the acknowledgement carefully. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't assign fault. It simply existed, time-stamped and traceable. I archived the email and did nothing else. Somewhere inside the company, the issue was now visible to people who didn't report to my boss. People who wouldn't be swayed by confidence or convenience. I knew how these systems worked. Once flagged, they followed their own logic. My boss still believed silence favored him. He didn't realize it was doing the opposite. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my boss. It was short, almost casual. He asked if I was still expecting anything and suggested we could talk it through if needed. There was no mention of the missed deadline or the instruction he'd given payroll. Just a probe, testing whether I'd push back. I didn't respond. Instead, I reread the message and noticed what wasn't there: authority. The confidence from his first refusal had softened into something else. Curiosity, maybe? Or concern. He was checking whether the situation was still under his control. An hour later, another message came through, this one framed as friendly advice. He said delays like this happen sometimes, and that escalating wouldn't help anyone. The implication was clear: stay quiet, let it go, don't complicate things. I saved both messages and added them to my timeline. By reaching out, he'd confirmed something important. He knew the delay existed beyond our private exchange. He was reacting, not managing. And that meant the process had already started touching areas he couldn't see. I still didn't reply. Silence, in moments like this, isn't passive. It forces the other person to fill the gap with their own assumptions. And assumptions are where mistakes multiply. Whatever confidence he had left was thinning. I could feel it. On the third morning, I received a system-generated update from the same compliance portal. The status of the inquiry had changed. It was now marked as under preliminary review, with a note indicating that verification was in progress. No names. No accusations. Just movement. That was the moment I knew this had shifted beyond anyone's discretion. Preliminary review meant cross-checking records, contracts, payroll logs, internal approvals. It meant someone neutral was comparing what should have happened against what actually did. And discrepancies don't argue back. They just sit there, undeniable. I thought back to how confidently my boss had refused to pay me, how certain he'd sounded that resignation gave him leverage. He'd treated the situation like a private power play, assuming the rules bent around his authority. They didn't. Midday, a former coworker texted me cautiously, asking if I was doing okay and mentioning that payroll had gone unusually quiet. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. I simply said I was fine. Inside the company, people were starting to notice that something was off. Not dramatic enough to cause panic, but persistent enough to raise eyebrows. The kind of issue that makes departments stop replying and start documenting. I hadn't forced anything. I just stepped back and let the structure reveal itself. And once a structure is exposed, it can't be unseen. By the fourth day, payroll stopped responding altogether. Not just to me, internally as well. A former coworker mentioned that emails were being redirected to a shared inbox marked on hold, a quiet signal that communication had been restricted. That wasn't avoidance. It was protocol. Someone higher up had intervened and frozen responses until a review concluded. That detail mattered more than anything else so far. When payroll goes silent, it means they've been instructed to stop explaining and start preserving. Every message becomes a record. Every word potentially reviewed. The situation had crossed from inconvenience into exposure, and the safest move was to say nothing at all. I received another automated notification from the compliance system, this one confirming that relevant departments had been notified of the review. Still no accusations. Still no names. Just confirmation that the process was widening. I resisted the urge to feel vindicated. This wasn't personal anymore. It was mechanical. A set of rules reacting to a breach exactly as designed. The company had systems to protect itself from mistakes like this, even when leadership believed they were in control. My boss, however, had gone quiet. No more messages. No follow-ups. No casual attempts to talk it through. The silence felt heavier now, less confident. Like someone realizing too late that the ground beneath them wasn't solid. Whatever he thought would happen after refusing my pay hadn't materialized. Something else had. That afternoon, an email arrived requesting clarification on my official resignation date. It came from an address I didn't recognize at first, audit support. Not HR. Not payroll. Audit. The message was brief and neutral, asking me to confirm the timeline and attach any relevant documentation. I replied with facts only. Date. Time. Copy of my resignation acknowledgement. No commentary. No emotion. I treated it like any other professional verification request. Minutes later, I received a confirmation that my response had been logged. Inside the company, this was no longer contained within a single department. Audit didn't operate on persuasion or hierarchy. They operated on records. If something didn't line up, they didn't negotiate it away. They followed it until it did. I imagined my boss learning about this indirectly, perhaps through a forwarded email or a meeting request he hadn't anticipated. Audit involvement reframed everything. It wasn't about whether he meant to withhold my pay. It was about whether the company could justify having done so. I didn't hear from him that day. That silence felt different from before. Less strategic. More cautious. Like someone realizing the rules they thought they controlled were now being interpreted by people who didn't report to them. And once audit is involved, the story stops being personal. It becomes factual. Inside the company, my boss reassured his team that the situation was handled. I heard this secondhand, filtered through people who were trying to sound calm. He framed it as a misunderstanding that would resolve itself once the right boxes were checked. What he didn't mention was that he wasn't copied on the latest audit correspondence. That omission mattered. When processes move beyond management, visibility narrows. Decisions get made without looping in the person who started the issue. From that point on, authority doesn't mean access. And my boss was beginning to feel that gap. I received another system update that evening. The review had advanced, and additional verification was required. Still no urgency in the language, but the progression was unmistakable. This wasn't stalling. It was accelerating quietly. I thought back to how confidently he'd refused to pay me, how casually he'd implied that resignation stripped me of options. He'd assumed I'd react emotionally, escalate loudly, or give up. He hadn't considered what would happen if I did none of those things. By choosing restraint, I'd allowed the situation to move into channels he couldn't influence directly. Channels that didn't care about intent, only alignment with policy and law. Somewhere in the company, files were being opened and timelines reconstructed. And for the first time, my boss wasn't setting the pace. He was waiting for updates he couldn't control. That night, I looked up the wage regulations for my jurisdiction, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted precision. The law didn't leave much room for interpretation. Final pay had deadlines. Missed deadlines triggered reporting obligations. Reporting obligations triggered reviews that didn't stay internal for long. What stood out wasn't the penalties. It was the sequence. Once a certain amount of time passed, notification requirements kicked in automatically. Employers didn't get to decide whether the process moved forward. The system did it for them. I checked the calendar again. We were closer to that threshold than my boss likely realized. The next morning, an internal compliance notice was issued inside the company. I didn't see it myself, but a former coworker hinted at it in a careful text, saying there was a flag tied to payroll timing. The message was vague, but the implication was clear. The issue was now visible beyond payroll and management. I imagined my boss reading that notice and trying to trace it back, looking for a way to contain it. What he wouldn't find was a switch to turn it off. Once flagged, these things followed a path no single manager could redirect. I closed my browser and went about my day oddly calm. The law wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. And methodical processes are the hardest ones to stop once they're moving. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again from an unfamiliar number. This time, I answered. The woman on the line introduced herself as part of payroll governance. Not HR. Not legal counsel. Governance. Her voice was neutral, almost rehearsed, as she explained she was verifying information related to a delayed final payment. She asked why my pay hadn't been released. I told her I didn't know. I explained that I'd resigned, requested my final pay, and been informed it wouldn't be issued. I kept my tone factual and unemotional, answering only what was asked. She thanked me and said they'd follow up internally. That was it. No accusations. No promises. Just confirmation that the issue was now being reviewed independently. Governance teams existed to ensure compliance across departments, and once they stepped in, individual intent mattered less than documented action. After the call, I sat quietly, replaying my boss's earlier messages in my mind. The casual dismissal. The suggestion to let it go. He hadn't just underestimated me. He'd underestimated the system designed to catch exactly this kind of decision. Inside the company, this call would trigger more questions. Requests for justification. Explanations that had to be written down instead of implied. Each step would narrow his options further. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt inevitability. Once governance got involved, outcomes stopped being personal. They became procedural. By the end of the week, the shift inside the company was unmistakable. I heard about it in fragments, short texts, careful phrasing, pauses where people clearly didn't want to say too much. Meetings were being rescheduled. Managers were being asked to document decisions retroactively. Payroll access had been restricted further. That kind of activity doesn't happen unless leadership is nervous. I received a brief update from the compliance portal confirming the review had advanced to the next stage. Still neutral. Still understated. But each status change meant more eyes, more records pulled, more scrutiny applied. The process was no longer about whether my boss would pay me. It was about whether the company could justify why it hadn't. That distinction mattered. I thought back to my last conversation with him, how confident he'd sounded that resignation stripped me of leverage. He'd treated the situation like a private disagreement, something he could manage with silence and authority. What he hadn't accounted for was how silence functions inside regulated systems. silence doesn't end a process. It escalates it. Somewhere in the company, someone was now asking him to explain his decision in writing, to reference policy, to justify the instruction he'd given payroll. Each answer would be reviewed by people who didn't care about his position or intent. I hadn't forced any of this. I'd simply allowed the delay to exist. And delays, when they violate rules, have a way of speaking for themselves. On Monday morning, my boss emailed me again. This time, he dropped the casual tone. He said we should clear things up and suggested meeting in person. He didn't mention payroll, compliance, or the review that was quietly unfolding. Instead, he framed it as a misunderstanding between two professionals who could resolve things quickly if we just talked. The message told me everything I needed to know. If this were still under his control, he wouldn't be asking. He would be deciding. The invitation wasn't about resolution, it was about containment. A private conversation meant fewer records, fewer witnesses, fewer systems involved. I replied politely and declined. I said I preferred to keep everything in writing. The response didn't come immediately. When it did, it was shorter. He said he was trying to help and warned that dragging this out wouldn't benefit anyone. The implication was familiar. Stop before this goes further. I saved the email and added it to my timeline. By asking for a private meeting, he'd confirmed something important. The situation had reached a point where informal pressure felt necessary. Processes don't prompt that reaction. Exposure does. Inside the company, whatever confidence he still had was thinning. He wasn't directing the situation anymore. He was reacting to it, trying to slow something that had already moved beyond him. And I could feel the shift. Not loudly, but unmistakably. The next update came without warning. An escalation notice from the compliance portal, marked as action required, but not directed at me. It listed my case number, the category of issue, and a note indicating that management response was pending. Someone somewhere had been given a deadline. I didn't need to guess who. I imagined my boss being asked to explain, in writing, why my final pay had been withheld. Not verbally. Not casually. In a format that would be reviewed, archived, and possibly shared. He would have to cite policy, justify his authority, and confirm that his instruction aligned with company obligations and local law. There was no version of that explanation that worked. Withholding pay wasn't an oversight anymore. It was a documented decision. And documented decisions live longer than people expect. They get revisited, compared, questioned. They don't disappear once made inconvenient. That afternoon, I received another message from my boss, noticeably restrained. He said he was working through some internal processes and asked for patience. The confidence was gone. In its place was caution. I didn't reply. Patience wasn't something I needed to offer. The system had its own timelines now, and none of them depended on my cooperation. By stepping back, I was letting the structure do what it was designed to do when lines were crossed. The process didn't need encouragement. It only needed time. By midweek, the situation had expanded beyond my boss's department. I learned this indirectly through a former coworker who mentioned that the risk team had requested information related to payroll practices. Not just mine. Historical ones. Patterns. Precedents. That detail mattered. When risk teams get involved, the focus shifts from fixing a single issue to assessing exposure. They don't ask how to make something go away. They ask how bad it could get and who else might be affected. My delayed pay was no longer an isolated problem. It was a data point. Another update arrived from the portal. The review had moved forward again. No emotion. No commentary. Just progression. Each step meant more records pulled, more people looped in, more accountability distributed upward. Inside the company, leadership would now be aware. Not because my boss told them, but because the process required it. Once that happened, the narrative stopped being his to manage. It became something executives had to answer for. I thought back to how easily he'd dismissed my request, how certain he'd been that resignation stripped me of leverage. He'd assumed silence meant surrender. He was wrong. Silence had simply allowed the system to speak in my place. And the system was saying more than I ever could. By Thursday morning, the company's internal tone had shifted again. This time, it wasn't subtle. A former colleague told me the risk team had requested a briefing with senior leadership, specifically tied to payroll governance and management discretion. That phrase, management discretion, wasn't accidental. It was the kind of language used when someone's judgment was being evaluated, not just a process. My boss went quiet. No messages. No follow-ups. No attempts to clear things up. Silence from him now didn't feel strategic. It felt imposed. Like he'd been told to stop communicating while others reviewed what he'd already set in motion. That afternoon, I received another compliance update confirming that external verification may be required if discrepancies couldn't be resolved internally. The word may did a lot of work. It meant the company still had a narrow window to correct the issue before it moved beyond their walls. I realized then that time was no longer neutral. Every hour that passed without resolution narrowed their options. What could have been quietly fixed early on was now becoming something that required explanation. Inside the company, my boss wasn't defending his decision anymore. He was waiting for instructions. And waiting is never comfortable for someone used to control. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same silence he'd used to dismiss me was now being used to contain him. Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my boss. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, his voice sounded different, measured, careful, almost rehearsed. He said he wanted to resolve things quickly and suggested there had been a misunderstanding. He didn't deny withholding my pay. He just didn't explain it anymore. He asked if we could talk off the record. That phrase told me everything. There is no off the record when compliance, audit, and risk are involved. Every action becomes part of a chain, whether people want it to or not. By asking for a private conversation, he was trying to step outside a process that no longer belonged to him. I didn't call back. Instead, I reviewed the latest portal update. The review status had changed again, indicating that management responses were under evaluation. Someone was reading what he'd written, comparing it against policy, against law, against timestamps. I imagined him sitting in meetings, explaining his reasoning to people who didn't answer to him. People who didn't care about his intent, only whether his decision exposed the company. The power dynamic had fully reversed now. He wasn't managing fallout. He was the fallout. And everyone involved knew it. Friday arrived with a quiet finality. I received confirmation that my case had been formally logged as a compliance incident, not a payroll delay. That classification mattered. Incidents require documentation, review, and closure. They don't get buried or reframed. They get resolved. Inside the company, leadership was now fully aware. This wasn't speculation anymore, it was procedure. The issue had crossed the line where discretion ends and accountability begins. My boss's decision was no longer a private misstep. It was a record. I heard later that he'd been asked to provide a timeline of events, including when and why he instructed payroll to withhold my pay. Not verbally. In writing. With acknowledgement that the information could be reviewed later. That kind of request doesn't come with reassurance. I thought back to our first exchange, how confident he'd been that resignation stripped me of options. He'd treated authority like insulation, believing it protected him from consequence. It didn't. By refusing to pay me, he hadn't just delayed compensation. He'd created a trail that led straight back to his judgment. And now that trail was being followed by people whose job was to see where it ended. I still hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded anything. I'd simply stepped aside and let the system do what it does best when someone oversteps. Reveal the truth slowly and without mercy. By Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the company had shifted in a way I could feel even from the outside. A former colleague told me leadership meetings were being rescheduled without explanation, some canceled entirely. When that happens, it usually means decisions are being made in smaller rooms, with fewer people present. Damage control rooms. Not planning rooms. I received a brief update from the compliance portal confirming the review had expanded in scope. The language was still neutral, but the implication was clear. This was no longer about resolving a single delayed payment. It was about determining whether internal controls had been bypassed intentionally. That distinction changes everything. My boss didn't reach out that day. Neither did HR. Silence had returned, but it wasn't the kind he'd used at the beginning. This silence felt enforced. Like communication had been restricted until leadership aligned on next steps. I went back through my timeline and noticed how clean it was. Every interaction documented. Every decision traceable. I hadn't needed to shape a narrative because the record already existed. That realization brought an unexpected calm. Inside the company, someone was now responsible for explaining why a routine resignation had turned into a compliance issue. Why safeguards hadn't worked sooner. Why one manager's confidence had overridden established process. None of those questions pointed at me. They all pointed upward. And once that happens, resolution stops being optional. It becomes necessary. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation that my final pay dispute had been formally reassigned outside my boss's department. The notice didn't name individuals. It didn't explain outcomes. It simply stated that responsibility now rested with an independent review group and that further contact would come through official channels. That was the moment my boss lost control entirely. Once a matter leaves a department, personal influence evaporates. Decisions are made based on records, not relationships. Explanations are evaluated, not accepted at face value. Whatever justification he'd offered was now being tested against policy and law, not authority. I heard that leadership had been briefed. Not casually. Formally. When executives get involved this way, it's rarely to fix a small problem. It's to understand exposure and limit fallout. The focus shifts from who's right to what could go wrong. Another message arrived from my boss that evening, carefully worded and noticeably restrained. He said he was working with leadership and asked for patience while things were sorted out. There was no request to talk. No attempt to negotiate. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer his decision to make. I didn't respond. At this point, responding would only slow the process. The system had taken over, and it didn't need my participation to keep moving. For the first time, the balance felt settled. Not because I'd won, but because the rules were finally being followed. 2 days later, the next update came through. My final pay had been approved for release, pending completion of corrective review steps. The phrasing mattered. Approved, not granted. Release, not favor. It was an administrative outcome, not a concession. What stood out was what followed. The notice referenced a broader corrective review related to management discretion and payroll authorization. My case wasn't being closed quietly. It was being used to evaluate whether procedures had been misused elsewhere. That explained why my boss hadn't contacted me again. I later learned he'd been asked to attend a review meeting with compliance and risk present. Not to discuss my pay specifically, but to explain his decision-making process. Those meetings don't focus on intent. They focus on impact. On whether someone understood the boundaries of their role and respected them. I thought back to how easily he'd refused to pay me, how confident he'd been that resignation stripped me of standing. That confidence had evaporated the moment the issue left his hands. When my payment finally hit my account, there was no notification, no apology, no acknowledgement from him. Just the deposit, exactly as required. The outcome wasn't dramatic. But it was definitive. I hadn't forced anything. I hadn't demanded justice. I'd simply allowed the system to reach the conclusion it was designed to reach when authority is misused. And once it does, there's no walking it back. The full impact of what had happened didn't surface all at once. It arrived in pieces, through careful wording and indirect signals. A former coworker mentioned that leadership was reviewing more than just payroll practices now. The scope had widened to include how discretion was exercised across teams, and whether managers understood where their authority actually ended. That mattered more than my pay ever did. My case had become a reference point. Not because it was extreme, but because it was simple. A clear decision. A clear violation. A clean paper trail. There was no ambiguity to hide behind. Whatever explanation my boss offered would now be measured against that clarity. I received a final compliance update noting that my issue had been resolved, but the review itself remained open. That distinction told me everything. Resolution didn't mean closure. It meant my part was finished. The rest would continue without me. Inside the company, the narrative had shifted again. People were no longer asking why my pay had been delayed. They were asking how a single manager had felt comfortable overriding established process so casually. Questions like that don't disappear. They linger. I thought back to the first message he'd sent, how confident he'd sounded that resignation stripped me of leverage. He'd mistaken authority for insulation. What this situation exposed wasn't malice. It was entitlement. And entitlement leaves traces that systems are very good at finding. A week later, I heard that my boss had been reassigned. Not fired. Not demoted publicly. Just moved out of a role that gave him unilateral discretion over people's livelihoods. The company framed it as an internal adjustment, nothing more. But inside, everyone understood what it meant. Trust had been reevaluated. That was the real consequence. Not the delayed pay. Not the compliance review. It was the realization that his judgment could no longer go unquestioned. Once that happens, authority never fully recovers. Every decision gets second-guessed. Every instruction gets reviewed. I wasn't involved in any of that. No one asked me for input or testimony. The records spoke clearly enough on their own. That was the quietest part of the outcome, how little I had to do once the process began. Looking back, I understood why he'd tried to keep things informal at first. A private refusal. A casual dismissal. He'd assumed the issue would stay between us. That assumption cost him more than paying me ever would have. The company didn't need to punish him loudly. They just needed to adjust where power sat. And they did. When systems correct themselves, they don't announce it. They recalibrate. And suddenly, things work very differently than before. I moved on without fanfare. There was no victory lap, no moment where I felt triumphant. What stayed with me was the clarity of it all. How easily authority can be misused, and how quietly systems respond when it is. My boss had believed confidence was enough. That if he spoke decisively, the matter would end. What he didn't account for was structure. The layers built precisely to catch decisions that feel small to the person making them but large to the people affected. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to threaten or escalate. I didn't even have to explain myself. All I did was step back and let the rules apply as written. Everything that followed came from that single choice. When people ask me now how I handled it, I tell them the truth. I didn't handle it at all. I let the system do what it was designed to do when someone assumes power they don't actually have. That lesson stayed with me. Authority isn't proven by how easily someone can say no. It's proven by whether their decisions can survive scrutiny. My bosses couldn't. And once that became clear, the outcome was inevitable. Not dramatic. Just final. And that, I've learned, is how real consequences usually arrive.